There is something happening right now that you are not fully aware of yet. Not on the surface. Not in the part of you that chose to press play or scroll past or let this find you in whatever way it did. That part of you, the surface part, has an explanation ready. Boredom, curiosity, a moment between other moments. That part of you is very good at explaining things. It has been explaining things your entire life, narrating your choices, cataloging your reasons, building a story about why you do what you do, and why things happen the way they happen. But there is a layer beneath that explanation. And in that layer, something different is occurring. Something that the surface explanation cannot account for, no matter how convincing it sounds. In that layer, beneath the casual story of how you arrived here, there is a precision at work, a mechanism so exact, so structurally calibrated to the frequency you are currently emitting, that the word coincidence does not just fall short. It falls away entirely, like a thin shell cracking open to reveal what was always moving inside it. You are here because something in you called for this. Not metaphorically, not as a comforting idea to make you feel special in a world that often makes you feel invisible, literally, in the most technical, mechanically precise sense of the word. There is a layer beneath the surface of your reality that operates on principles so exact, so responsive, so architecturally intelligent, that what you call chance is simply what those principles look like from the surface. From the outside. From the thin outer layer that most people never look beneath. Today, we go beneath it. And what you find there is not comfortable. It is not the warm reassurance of a universe that loves you in the way a parent loves a child, unconditionally and without demand. What you find beneath the surface of your reality is something far more precise than love and far more demanding than comfort. What you find is law, ancient, immovable, quantum verified law. The kind that does not bend for your feelings or your circumstances, or the story you have been telling yourself about why your life looks the way it looks. What you find when you peel back the surface is that you have been the architect of everything you have been trying to escape, and that is not a punishment. That is the most liberating thing you will ever understand. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. That is a deeper layer, and we do not skip layers here. We peel them back one at a time, carefully, the way you would excavate something ancient and irreplaceable. Because each layer you skip is a layer you will eventually have to come back to. And coming back to a skipped layer is always harder than going through it in sequence. So let us start at the surface. Let us start with what you think you know. You think you know what awakening is. You have heard the word. You have seen it used in 100 different contexts, applied to 100 different experiences, marketed in 100 different directions. Awakening, enlightenment, consciousness expansion, spiritual evolution. The words have been circulating long enough that they have developed a kind of comfortable familiarity. You know what they mean, or you think you do. You have a working definition, something about becoming more aware, Something about seeing through illusions. Something about a shift in perception that changes how you experience your life. That is the surface version, and the surface version is not wrong. It is just the thinnest outer layer of something with dimensions you have not yet measured. The surface version is what the concept looks like from the outside before you peel back what is underneath it. It is the label on the jar. And we are about to open the jar because beneath the surface understanding of awakening, there is a mechanism, a precise, structured, quantum-verified mechanism that operates according to laws so consistent and so measurable that the ancient world built entire civilizations around mapping them, and the modern world accidentally rediscovered them in particle accelerators and quantum physics laboratories, and then, almost immediately, failed to understand what it had found. That failure is not accidental, but that is also a deeper layer. Let us stay here for a moment. Let us stay with the surface, because the surface needs to be fully established before it can be fully dismantled. And it needs to be fully dismantled before you can see what is underneath it. The surface understanding of awakening goes something like this. You are asleep. You have been conditioned, programmed, shaped by your environment, your culture, your upbringing, your collective story, into a particular way of seeing. That way of seeing is limited. It filters out certain frequencies of reality and amplifies others. It creates a kind of tunnel vision that feels like the whole view. And awakening is the process of that tunnel widening, of the filters dissolving, of the conditioned seeing giving way to something clearer, something larger, something closer to what is actually there. That is the surface. And again, it is not wrong. But here is the first layer beneath it. The thing doing the seeing is also part of what needs to be seen. The observer is not separate from the observation. The one who is supposedly waking up is itself a construction of the very sleep it is trying to wake from. And this is not a philosophical riddle designed to make you feel clever at dinner parties. This is the precise finding of quantum mechanics, arrived at through decades of rigorous experimentation, and it is the thing that should have changed everything about how humanity understands consciousness and reality and the relationship between them. It did not change everything. Not at the surface level, not in the way most people live and think and move through their days, but it changed everything at the level beneath the surface. And that is the level we are excavating today. Quantum mechanics discovered, through experiments that have been replicated thousands of times, and that remain among the most robustly verified findings in the history of science, that the act of observation changes what is observed. Not as a metaphor, not as a philosophical suggestion, as a measured, documented, reproducible physical fact. The observer is not a passive receiver of information from a pre-existing reality. The observer is a participant in the construction of that reality. The act of looking at something at the quantum level is an act of collapsing infinite possibility into a single specific outcome. Let that land for a moment. Let it move past the surface level where it sounds like an interesting physics fact and into the layer beneath, where it becomes something else entirely. If the act of observation collapses possibility into actuality, then what you attend to, what you give the sustained, focused energy of your consciousness to, is not merely what you notice. It is what you call into being. It is what you select from the infinite field of quantum possibility and crystallize into the particular, solid, experiential reality you then call your life. Your attention is not passive. Your attention is creative. Your attention is the mechanism by which the quantum field becomes your specific lived experience. This is where the veil lifts, and this is also where the ancient world meets the quantum world. Because this is not a new understanding. This is a very, very old understanding that was buried under centuries of materialist philosophy, institutional religion that had its own reasons for keeping you passive and receptive rather than active and creative, and a scientific paradigm that spent 300 years insisting that the universe was a machine that operated independently of the minds observing it. The ancient initiates, the ones who built the mystery schools of Egypt and Greece and India and Mesopotamia, the ones who encoded their deepest knowledge in symbol and myth and architecture, precisely because they knew that surface-level transmission could not carry it intact. Those initiates understood something about the relationship between consciousness and reality that quantum mechanics is only now catching up to with its instruments. They understood that attention is not a cognitive function. Attention is a force, a literal, dense, directional emanation of creative energy that flows from the conscious being outward into the quantum field and participates in the selection of what that field becomes. They called it different things in different traditions. Prana in the Sanskrit texts, Pneuma in the Greek mysteries, Chi in the Chinese philosophical traditions, Vril in the Western esoteric lineage. The names are different. The map is the same. And the map says this: where your attention goes, your creative force flows. What receives your creative force receives your life energy. What receives your life energy becomes more real, more solid, more present in your experience. Not because you imagined it there, because you literally, at the quantum mechanical level, participated in collapsing the probability field in that direction. If this transmission is reaching the layer beneath your surface, understanding, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, so this work continues to find the people who are ready for it. Now let us go deeper, because there is a layer beneath that understanding that changes the meaning of everything above it. If attention is creative force, if where you look is where your life energy flows, then the question of what you have been attending to becomes the most important question you have never been asked to seriously examine. Not what you want, not what you dream about, not what you tell yourself you are focused on, what you actually, habitually, repeatedly, day after day, moment after moment, give the sustained energy of your consciousness to. And when you look at that honestly, when you peel back the comfortable story about your intentions and your aspirations and your goals, and you look at the actual pattern of your attention over the course of an ordinary day, what do you find? Most people find a pattern of attention that is almost entirely reactive, almost entirely directed outward, toward stimuli that were designed by other people and other systems to capture and hold that attention. Almost entirely fragmented, scattered across dozens of surfaces simultaneously, never resting long enough on any single thing to generate the depth of creative force that actual materialization requires. Most people find, when they look honestly, that they have been bleeding, not physically, not in any way that leaves a visible mark, but energetically, constantly, from 1,000 tiny points of leakage that collectively drain the creative reservoir that was meant to be building the architecture of their actual life. And this bleeding is not accidental. This is the layer that most conversations about awakening never reach. This is the layer that was buried not by neglect, but by design. There is a story here. An ancient one, though it has modern echoes. Let me take you into it. Imagine a woman named Mara. She lives in a city built on a hill, and beneath that city, buried under centuries of stone and mortar, and the accumulated weight of everything built on top of it, there is a spring. A pure underground spring of extraordinary pressure and mineral richness. This spring was the reason the city was built where it was. The original founders knew it was there. They built their most sacred structures directly above it. They designed channels and chambers to direct its flow. They understood that the spring was the source, that the city was an expression of the spring, that the health and vitality of everything above ground was a function of the relationship between the inhabitants and the water flowing beneath them. But that was a long time ago. The original founders are gone. The channels and chambers were buried under new construction. The sacred structures were demolished and replaced with buildings that had no relationship to what was beneath them, and the people of the city, including Mara, grew up knowing nothing about the spring. They grew up understanding the city as a collection of surfaces, streets and walls and windows, and the noise of other people's lives. They learned to navigate the surfaces. They became expert surface dwellers. Mara is 34 years old, and she is tired in a way she cannot explain. She sleeps enough, she eats. She moves through her days, completing the things her days require. But there is a heaviness that does not lift, a flatness behind her eyes that no amount of sleep or food or distraction seems to touch. She has tried to explain it to people. They look at her blankly. Her life looks fine from the outside, better than fine, by most measures. She has no language for what she is feeling, because the language she was given was designed to describe surfaces, and what she is feeling is happening at a deeper layer. One evening, Mara is walking through the oldest part of the city, the part that the developers have not yet reached, and she notices something in the ground, a faint sound, not quite a sound, a vibration. She stops. She stands very still. The vibration is there, beneath the stone, beneath the noise of the city, faint but unmistakably present. Something is moving down there. She asks an old man sitting outside a doorway, what is beneath this part of the city? He looks at her for a long moment, as if deciding whether she is ready for the answer. Then he says, "Everything. Everything is beneath this part of the city. The spring that fed the founders, the channels they built, the chambers they designed, all of it is still there, has always been there. The city was built on top of it, not instead of it." Mara spends the next 3 years of her life finding her way down to that spring, and what she discovers when she gets there changes not just her understanding of the city, it changes her understanding of her own fatigue, because she realizes, standing in that ancient chamber with the spring flowing beneath her feet, that the heaviness she has carried her entire life was not depression. It was not a chemical imbalance or a character flaw or the inevitable weight of adult existence. It was the sensation of being cut off from her source, of living entirely at the surface of a reality that had infinite depth beneath it, and never having been shown the way down. The spring had been there the entire time. She had been walking over it every day of her life. It was hidden in plain sight. Hidden not by conspiracy, but by the accumulated layers of a civilization that had forgotten it was there and built its entire surface on top of the forgetting. You are Mara, and the spring is not a metaphor. What is the hidden layer you have recently discovered beneath the surface of your own life? Drop it in the comments. Not the polished version, the honest one. The layer you actually touched, not the one you think you should have reached. Let us go back to the quantum layer now, because the parable points to something that the science can verify, and the science points to something that the parable can illuminate, and together they describe a reality that neither can fully convey alone. Quantum mechanics, specifically the work that emerged from the double-slit experiment and its implications from the Copenhagen interpretation, from the work of physicists like David Bohm, who developed the concept of the implicate order, describes reality as having exactly the structure that Mara discovered beneath her city. A surface layer of explicit, visible, measurable, apparently solid reality, and beneath that surface, an implicate order, a deeper layer where everything that appears on the surface is enfolded, where the separations and distinctions and solid edges of the surface world dissolve into a unified field of undivided wholeness. Bohm called it the implicate order not as a metaphor, but as a precise description of what the mathematics of quantum mechanics actually implies. That the visible, explicit world of separate objects and linear time and fixed locations is a kind of unfolding of a deeper order that is not visible, not explicit, not separate, and not fixed. And here is the layer beneath that. Consciousness is not a product of the explicit order. Consciousness is not something that the brain generates the way a factory generates a product, a material output of a material process. Consciousness, according to the deepest implications of quantum mechanics and the most sophisticated models that physicists like Bohm and his colleague Carl Pribram developed, is itself part of the implicate order. Consciousness is not on the surface. Consciousness is in the depth. and what you experience as your awareness. Your sense of being a self that looks out at a world is the point where the implicate order surfaces into the explicit, the point where the depth becomes visible. This is where the veil lifts again, and this time it lifts onto something that should permanently alter your relationship with the experience you call your life. If consciousness is part of the implicate order, if it belongs to the depth rather than the surface, then your true nature is not the surface self you have been managing and maintaining and presenting to the world. Your true nature is the depth that the surface self is an expression of. You are not a surface dweller who occasionally glimpses something deeper. You are depth that has temporarily forgotten its depth and is experiencing itself as surface. And awakening is not the surface self becoming more enlightened. Awakening is the surface self recognizing what it actually is. The depth recognizing itself through the surface. The implicate order becoming aware of itself through the point where it has unfolded into explicit experience. The ancient traditions knew this. Every single one of them, across every culture and every century that left records deep enough to preserve this understanding, arrived at the same description of what the human being actually is. Not a material creature with an occasional spiritual experience. A spiritual reality having a temporary material experience. Not a surface with depth beneath it. Depth that has created a surface as its means of engaging with the explicit world. The Hindu tradition called the surface self the ego, the ahamkara, the I-maker, the faculty that constructs the sense of being a separate individual self. And it was absolutely clear that the ahamkara is not what you are. It is what you are using. It is the instrument through which the deeper self, the Atman, the pure consciousness that is identical with the universal consciousness, engages with the material plane. The ahamkara is the surface. The Atman is the depth. And the fundamental confusion of human existence, the root of all suffering in the Buddhist analysis, the original ignorance in the Vedantic framework, is the confusion of the surface for the depth, the mistaking of the instrument for the player. The Sufi mystics described it as the veil of the nafs, the veils of the ego self, and they mapped those veils with extraordinary precision, describing exactly how each layer of ego identification conceals the deeper reality beneath it, and exactly what the process of dissolving each veil reveals. They were not speaking metaphorically. They were describing a precise interior cartography that they had mapped through direct experience and transmitted through their lineages for centuries. The Gnostic traditions of early Christianity, the ones that were systematically suppressed and whose texts were buried in clay jars in the Egyptian desert and not rediscovered until 1945, described the material world itself as a kind of veil, a surface projection of a deeper spiritual reality, and described the human being as a spark of divine light that had become trapped in the surface and forgotten its origin in the depth. These traditions are not saying the same thing accidentally. They are mapping the same territory from different starting points and arriving at the same coordinates. And now quantum mechanics has arrived at those coordinates from a completely different direction, using completely different instruments, and found that the map was accurate. The surface is not the whole of what exists. The depth is more real than the surface. And you are the depth. But there is still another layer beneath this, and this layer is the one that most spiritual traditions reached, but most modern presentations of those traditions have buried under layers of comfort and accessibility, and the desire not to disturb the people who are paying for the teaching. The layer beneath the beautiful truth that you are the depth is this. The depth makes demands. Not the kind of demands that a tyrant makes of a subject, the kind of demands that truth makes of anyone who has chosen to see it. The demand of coherence, the demand of alignment, the demand that the surface you are presenting to the world and the depth you actually are begin to move toward each other rather than away from each other. Because here is what happens when depth and surface are radically misaligned, when the surface self is living in complete contradiction to the deeper nature it is an expression of. The energy that should be flowing from the depth through the surface and into the world as creative force, as the materialization of the deeper self's actual intentions, gets blocked. It cannot flow through a surface that is oriented in the wrong direction. It cannot express itself through a self that is constantly hemorrhaging its creative force into reactions and distractions and the maintenance of a surface identity that has nothing to do with what it actually is. And the result is exactly what Mara felt. The inexplicable heaviness, the flatness behind the eyes, the sense of going through motions without any sense of where the motion is leading, the exhaustion that sleep does not touch because it is not physical exhaustion. It is the exhaustion of a being that is fighting against its own nature every single day. This is the mechanism of the spiritual emergency that most people are living in right now, without having language for it. Not a crisis of external circumstances, a crisis of misalignment between surface and depth, between who you are presenting yourself as and what you actually are, between where you are directing your attention and what your deeper nature is actually trying to create. And the reason this video found you, the reason this transmission arrived at this precise moment in your life, is that the misalignment has reached a threshold. Something in the depth of you has sent a signal, not a gentle suggestion, a demand that the surface stop pretending the depth does not exist. A demand that the attention stop bleeding into surfaces that have nothing to do with what you actually are. A demand that the veil between your surface experience and your deeper nature begin to thin. That is what awakening actually is. Not a pleasant expansion of awareness, not a comfortable widening of the tunnel. A demand from the depth that the surface stop lying about what it is. Now let us go to the quantum layer beneath the mechanism of attention, because this is where the science becomes almost unbearably precise. There is a principle in quantum mechanics called quantum coherence. It describes the state in which quantum systems maintain their wave-like, probabilistic, infinite possibility nature. When a quantum system is coherent, it exists in superposition, meaning it is simultaneously in all possible states at once. It has not yet collapsed into a single specific outcome. It retains the full creative potential of the quantum field. Decoherence is what happens when a quantum system interacts with its environment in a way that forces it to collapse into a single specific state. When it loses its superposition. When it stops being all possibilities and becomes one fixed, specific, measurable thing. Now, what causes decoherence? Observation. Interaction. The entanglement of the quantum system with the classical environment around it. The more a quantum system is entangled with its environment, the faster it decoheres. The faster it collapses from infinite possibility into fixed, determined, specific actuality. Let that land at the level beneath the physics. Your consciousness, your attention, your creative force operates on exactly this principle. When your attention is coherent, when it is gathered, focused, directed from the depth of what you actually are toward the specific reality you are actually intending to create, it retains its full creative power. It operates from the quantum level. It has not yet collapsed into a single fixed outcome. It holds the full spectrum of possibility. But when your attention is constantly entangled with the environment, when it is reactive, scattered, pulled in 100 directions by the stimuli of the surface world, it decoheres, it collapses, it loses its creative power and becomes simply a response mechanism, a system that is determined by its environment rather than determining it. The ancient initiates described this as the difference between a sovereign and a slave, not in terms of social position or material wealth, though those things follow from the deeper principle. In terms of the direction of causation, the sovereign is one whose consciousness flows from the inside out, from the depth to the surface, from the implicate to the explicit, from intention to manifestation. The slave is one whose consciousness flows from the outside in, from the surface to the depth, from the environment to the reaction, from the stimulus to the response. And the entire architecture of the modern world, the information environment, the attention economy, the constant stream of stimuli that the average person is immersed in from the moment they wake to the moment they sleep, is designed, whether consciously or simply, as an emergent property of systems optimized for engagement to keep human consciousness in a state of maximum decoherence, maximum entanglement with the external environment, maximum reactivity, maximum fragmentation of attention. Because a decoherent consciousness is a predictable consciousness. A reactive consciousness is a manageable consciousness. A consciousness that is constantly entangled with the surface world cannot access the depth from which its actual creative power flows. This is the hidden layer beneath the surface understanding of distraction. Distraction is not merely an inconvenience. Distraction is not simply a productivity problem. Distraction is the mechanism by which creative force is systematically drained from the human being and redirected into systems that feed on it. Every time your attention is captured by something that has nothing to do with what you are actually here to create, you are not simply wasting time. You are providing your creative force as fuel for whatever captured your attention. You are collapsing your quantum superposition in someone else's direction. You are using your capacity to call reality into being, to call their reality into being, instead of yours. This is not conspiracy theory. This is the precise mechanical description of what happens at the quantum level when attention flows from a conscious being to an external object or system. The object or system receives the creative force. The being loses it. And the beings who understood this, the ones who built the mystery schools, and the initiatic traditions, and the esoteric lineages, they built those structures precisely to protect the initiated individual from this drain. The practices of silence and solitude, and contemplation, and the withdrawal of attention from the mundane world were not ascetic self-punishment. They were the precise technical procedures for maintaining quantum coherence, for keeping the creative force gathered and directed rather than scattered and drained. The desert fathers of early Christian monasticism, who sat in caves and refused to engage with the world, were not running away from life. They were running toward the depth of it. They understood that the surface world is a feast of attention-capturing stimuli, and that the first and most fundamental act of spiritual sovereignty is the deliberate withdrawal of attention from everything that does not serve the deepening of your connection to what you actually are. Let me show you a second layer of this through another story. There was a man named Elias who lived in a valley between two mountains. The valley was rich and fertile, fed by a river that came from deep in the northern mountain. The river was cold and clear and powerful. It had fed the valley for as long as anyone could remember. Elias had grown up with the river. He had taken it for granted the way you take for granted anything that has always been there. But over the years, the people of the valley had begun diverting the river. Small diversions at first, a channel here to water a field, a channel there to fill a mill pond, then larger diversions. A canal to the eastern settlement, an aqueduct to the new town being built on the plain. Each diversion seemed reasonable in isolation. Each one served a purpose. But no one was keeping track of the total. Elias noticed it first as a change in the sound. The river had always made a particular sound as it ran through the center of the valley, a deep, resonant, continuous sound that he had heard his entire life. One morning he realized the sound had changed. It was thinner, higher in pitch. He went to look and found the river running low, barely covering the stones at its center that had always been submerged. He followed the river upstream, looking for the cause. He found the diversions, dozens of them, each one small and apparently innocent. But together, they had taken so much of the river's flow. that what remained was a shadow of what it had been. The valley was still green, but only because the soil retained moisture from years of the river's abundance. Give it another season, Elias thought, and the green would begin to go. He spent the next year closing the diversions, not all of them. Some were necessary. Some served genuine purposes that could not be abandoned, but many of them were feeding things that did not need to be fed. Fields that could be watered by rain, ponds that served no function, channels that had been dug out of habit or convenience, and were now simply routes through which the river's power drained away into the dry ground. As he closed each unnecessary diversion, the river rose, slowly at first, then with increasing speed as the cumulative effect of the closures built. By the end of the year, the river was running as it had when he was a child, deep and cold and resonant. The sound had returned. The valley was not just green, it was abundant in a way that it had not been in decades. The river is your attention. The diversions are the 1,000 small habitual directions in which you send it without noticing, without choosing, without asking whether this is where your creative force is meant to flow. And the valley is your life. The practice that the ancient traditions called by various names, recollection, mindfulness, the gathering of the self, the return to center, is the practice of closing the unnecessary diversions, not all engagement with the world, not the hermit's complete withdrawal, but the deliberate, systematic closing of every channel through which your creative force is flowing into things that do not serve what you are actually here to build. And here is the layer beneath the practice that makes the practice possible. You cannot close diversions you cannot see. You cannot reclaim attention that you do not know you are losing. The first and most foundational act of the practice is not the withdrawal of attention. It is the seeing of where your attention actually is. This is a practice you can do right now, not as an exercise in self-judgment or criticism, as an act of honest archaeology. Take a single ordinary day in your recent life and trace the actual movements of your attention through it. Not the movements you intended, not the movements you would describe if someone asked you what you did. The actual movements, the reactive pulls, the habitual diversions, the moments when something external captured your gaze and held it for minutes or hours in directions that had nothing to do with what you actually want to create. Most people, when they do this honestly for the first time, find that the vast majority of their attention in any given day is not directed by them. It is captured by the environment. It is reactive. It is habitual. It is the result of systems and stimuli that were designed by other people and other interests to hold it. The discovery of this is not a cause for despair. It is the first lifting of the veil, the first moment of genuine seeing. Because you cannot change a pattern you cannot see. And once you see it, once you actually trace the movements of your attention through a day and recognize the extent to which those movements are not yours, the recognition itself begins to create space, a gap between the stimulus and the response, a moment of choice, where before there was only reaction. That gap is where awakening lives. Not in some distant enlightened state that requires years of practice and the right teacher and the right circumstances. In the gap, in the moment between the pull of the external world and the automatic movement of your attention toward it. In that gap, however small, however brief, is the depth, is the implicate order, is the quantum field of infinite possibility that the surface world is a thin projection of. And every time you find that gap and choose, consciously, deliberately, from the depth of what you actually are, where your attention goes, you are not just making a better decision. You are exercising the faculty that makes you what you are. You are practicing being the depth rather than the surface. You are rehearsing sovereignty. Think about the moment you first sensed something beneath the surface of your own life. A truth that was hidden in plain sight until you were finally ready to see it. Share it in the comments. What you name there may be the exact layer someone else has been standing on, feeling the vibration beneath, not yet having the words for it. But there is a layer beneath even this. And this is the layer that most people who begin the practice of attention reclamation eventually hit, and where many of them stop. Because this layer is uncomfortable. This layer requires something that the comfortable surface version of spiritual practice does not require. It requires you to look at what you have been building with the attention you have already spent. Here is the quantum truth of this. The attention you have given over the course of your life has been creating. It has not been wasted in the sense of producing nothing. It has been creating exactly what it was pointed at. If your attention has been predominantly reactive, it has been creating a reactive life, a life that feels like it is happening to you rather than through you. If your attention has been predominantly directed at the problems and fears and catastrophes of the surface world, it has been creating a life that is full of problems and fears and the constant anticipation of catastrophe. Not because you attracted those things through some simplified law of attraction, because you have been using your quantum creative force to continuously collapse the probability field in those directions. This is not blame. This is not a judgment of your choices or your character. This is a description of a mechanism, the same mechanism that once understood and redirected can create something entirely different. But the understanding has to be complete. You cannot selectively accept the part of the mechanism that feels good, the part that says your attention is creative and you can use it to build what you want, and reject the part that feels confronting, the part that says everything you are currently experiencing is also a product of that same creative attention. The mechanism does not have a good side and a bad side. It has one side, and that side is operating continuously, whether you are aware of it or not. The ancient initiates called this the law of correspondence. As above, so below. As within, so without. What is in the depth is reflected in the surface. What is in the surface is an expression of the depth. The outer world is a mirror of the inner world. Not because the universe is a wish fulfillment machine, but because the consciousness that creates the inner world and the consciousness that participates in creating the outer world are the same consciousness. You are not separate from your reality. You are its co-creator. And you have been co-creating it all along, whether you knew it or not. The moment you fully accept this, the moment it lands not as an intellectual concept, but as a lived recognition, something shifts. Not gradually, suddenly, like a veil lifting, because the moment you accept full co-creatorship of your reality, you also accept full capacity to redirect it. The same creative force that has been building the life you have been trying to escape is the creative force that can build the life you have been trying to reach. Nothing changes except the direction. But the direction change requires something. It requires the thing that the surface version of spiritual practice almost never asks for, and the depth version always demands. It requires that you stop, that you actually stop. Not in the sense of ceasing all activity, in the sense of ceasing the unconscious, reactive, habitual movement of your attention through the world. The kind of stopping that the contemplative traditions call recollection, the gathering of the scattered self back to its center, the closing of the diversions. And this stopping is not natural. It does not happen on its own. It requires a deliberate act of will that runs directly counter to every conditioned reflex you have developed over a lifetime of being a surface dweller in a world designed to keep your attention on the surface. Let us talk about what that act of will actually looks like, not as an abstract principle, as a concrete, embodied, moment-by-moment practice. The practice begins with a single question, not a complicated question, not a question that requires deep reflection or extended analysis. A simple, immediate, answerable question that you ask in the moment before your attention moves anywhere. The question is this mine? Is this where my attention actually belongs? Is this a direction that serves what I am actually here to create? Or is this a diversion? A pull from the external world that has nothing to do with what I am and what I am building? You do not need to answer this question with a lengthy deliberation. The answer is usually immediate, usually obvious, usually available in the first instant of honest attention. The habitual diversions have a particular quality when you look at them honestly. A kind of hollowness, a sense that there is nothing at the end of this direction that belongs to you. That whatever is pulling your attention is pulling it toward itself, not toward you. The practice is to notice that quality, to recognize it in the moment it arises, and then to make a choice, not a dramatic choice, not a heroic act of willpower, a quiet, deliberate, sovereign choice, to withdraw your attention from the diversion and return it to your center, to close that particular channel and let the water rise. You will do this imperfectly. You will notice the diversions after you have already been in them for an hour. You will close one channel and immediately open another. You will practice for 3 days and then spend a week in complete unconscious reactivity. This is not failure. This is the practice. The practice is not the maintenance of perfect attention coherence. The practice is the returning, the noticing and the returning, again and again and again, until the returning becomes faster, becomes more natural, becomes the default direction of your attention rather than the exception. And as the returning becomes more natural, something begins to happen that cannot be explained by the surface-level mechanics of productivity or focus or the simple reduction of wasted time. Something happens at the deeper level, at the quantum level, at the level where your consciousness touches the implicate order and participates in the selection of what unfolds from it. The creative force that was scattered begins to cohere. The quantum superposition that was constantly collapsing in 100 reactive directions begins to hold. The depth begins to become available to the surface in a way that it was not when the surface was too entangled with the external environment to receive what the depth was trying to send through it. And this is what the ancient traditions called the accumulation of power. Not power in the sense of dominance or control over others, power in the most literal physical sense, the capacity to do work, the capacity to create change, the capacity to move from intention to manifestation without the intention being dissipated before it can reach the material level. When the river is running full, it can move mountains. When it is reduced to a trickle by 1,000 diversions, it cannot move a stone. But there is still a layer beneath this, and this is the deepest layer we will reach today. The layer that the surface understanding of awakening, and even most of the intermediate layers, never quite touches. The layer that was guarded most carefully in the ancient traditions, not because it was dangerous in a dramatic sense, but because it was the layer most likely to be misunderstood, misused, or simply rejected as too demanding by anyone who had not yet been prepared by the layers above it. The deepest layer is this: awakening is not something that happens to you. Awakening is something you are. It is not a state you achieve. It is a recognition of what you have always been. It is not the surface self becoming enlightened. It is the depth recognizing itself. And the depth does not need to be created or cultivated or achieved. It needs to be uncovered, unveiled, freed from the layers of surface identification that have been covering it. And those layers of surface identification, the ones that have been covering the depth of what you actually are not your enemy. They are not obstacles to be destroyed. They are the very material through which the depth has been trying to express itself. They are the surface of the spring, the explicit unfolding of the implicate. They are what you have been, and they are also, in their deepest function, the means by which the depth engages with the material world. The invitation is not to destroy the surface. The invitation is to stop confusing the surface for the whole. To stop living as if the surface is all there is. To hold the surface lightly as the instrument it is, while remaining rooted in the depth that it is an expression of. This is the shift. This is what the Zen tradition calls the great turning. What the Vedantic tradition calls the shift from ahamkara identification to Atman recognition. What the Sufi tradition calls the lifting of the veils of the nafs. What quantum mechanics in its most philosophically complete formulations, describes as the shift from classical to quantum consciousness, from the decoherent, entangled, reactive mode to the coherent, sovereign, creative mode. And this shift is not a single event. It is not a moment of enlightenment after which everything is permanently different and you never struggle again. It is a direction you choose again and again in every moment where the choice is available. The direction of depth over surface, of coherence over decoherence, of the implicate over the explicit, of what you actually are over what you have been conditioned to believe you are. Every time you choose that direction, even for a moment, even imperfectly, even in the middle of a day that has been entirely reactive and scattered and surface-bound, you are practicing awakening, not as a spiritual achievement, as a return, as the depth recognizing itself through the surface for one more moment, as the veil thinning by one more layer, and the veil does thin. This is not a metaphor. This is a description of an actual process that happens in the consciousness of a being who is consistently, over time, choosing the direction of depth over surface. The habitual identification with the surface self loosens. The reactive pulls of the external world lose some of their automatic grip. The gap between stimulus and response, the gap where the depth lives, widens. Not dramatically, not all at once, but measurably, noticeably, in the way that a fog does not lift all at once, but thins gradually until you realize you can see things that were invisible an hour ago. There is a quality of experience that begins to emerge as the veil thins. The ancient traditions described it in different ways. The Buddhists called it Rigpa, the naked awareness that underlies all experience. The Vedantins called it Sat Chit Ananda, being consciousness bliss. The Christian mystics called it the peace that passes understanding. The Sufis called it Fana, the annihilation of the separate self in the recognition of the deeper unity. Whatever you call it, the quality is recognizable. It is the quality of being fully present without being swept away, of being in the world without being of it, in the sense that the world's stimuli and dramas and pulls no longer have the same automatic claim on your attention, of seeing the surface clearly while remaining rooted in the depth, of being the depth that is temporarily expressed as a surface, rather than the surface that occasionally glimpses a depth. This is not a state of detachment in the cold, disconnected sense that word sometimes implies. It is a state of deeper connection, because when you are no longer constantly entangled with the surface world in the reactive, decoherent way that drains your creative force, you can actually meet the world. You can actually be present to what is here. You can actually respond from the depth of what you are, rather than simply react from the surface of what you have been conditioned to be. And your responses from that depth carry a quality that your reactions from the surface never did. They carry the weight of the implicate order, the authority of something that comes from beneath the surface rather than being generated by it. People feel this quality without being able to name it. They describe it as presence, as groundedness, as a kind of gravity that does not demand attention but naturally receives it, as the quality of someone who knows something that the surface world has not yet caught up to. This is what the ancient traditions called magnetism. Not the metaphorical magnetism of charisma or attractiveness, though those are often its surface expressions. The literal energetic magnetism of a consciousness that has accumulated its creative force rather than dissipating it. A consciousness that is coherent rather than decoherent. A consciousness that operates from the depth of the implicate order rather than the surface of the explicit world. And this magnetism is not something you perform or project or manufacture. It is what you become when you stop performing and projecting and manufacturing the surface self and start inhabiting the depth that was always there beneath it. The surface self is exhausting to maintain. It requires constant energy, constant management, constant adjustment to the expectations and perceptions of the external world. It is the source of the fatigue that Mara felt. The fatigue that does not respond to sleep, because it is not the fatigue of the body, but the fatigue of a consciousness that is spending all of its energy maintaining a surface that has nothing to do with the depth it is covering. When the surface self loosens, when the identification with it relaxes even slightly, the energy that was going into its maintenance becomes available for something else, for the actual work of creation, for the actual expression of what you are, for the actual building of the life that the depth of you has been trying to build all along, while the surface self was busy managing its image and reacting to the external world and maintaining the story of who it is and why it is the way it is. This is the energy that the ancient traditions were talking about when they spoke of the accumulation of vital force. Not a mystical substance that flows through invisible channels, though that is one way of describing it. The simple, quantum mechanical reality of creative force that is no longer being dissipated through reactive attention and surface self-maintenance, and is therefore available for coherent, directed, creative engagement with the quantum field. And this is why the awakening that this video found you for is not a comfortable process, not at the level where it actually happens. At the surface level, the concept of awakening is comfortable. It sounds like expansion and liberation and light, and those things are real, but they are the surface expressions of a process that, at the depth level, requires the dissolution of everything you have been using to avoid the depth. Every distraction, every habitual diversion of attention, every story about why you are the way you are, and why the world is the way it is, and why the things you want are not yet here. All of those things are layers, and layers dissolve. That is what they do when the depth beneath them is ready to surface. They do not dissolve comfortably. They dissolve the way a structure dissolves when the foundation beneath it shifts. With noise, with disruption, with the temporary feeling that everything is falling apart. What is falling apart is not you. What is falling apart is the surface you have been mistaking for you. And beneath what is falling apart, there is something that does not fall. Something that was never built and therefore cannot be demolished. something that has been there beneath every layer of your experience, beneath every identity you have inhabited, beneath every story you have told yourself about who you are and what you are capable of and what is possible for you. That something is what you actually are. And it has been waiting, with the patience of something that exists outside of time, for the surface to thin enough to let it through. This is the moment. Not because this video is special, not because this transmission carries some power that others do not, but because you are here. Because the signal that brought you here was a signal from the depth of you, through the surface of you, into the world you have been navigating on the surface. A signal that said, "It is time." The layers have accumulated long enough. The misalignment has persisted long enough. The bleeding has continued long enough. It is time to go beneath. And going beneath does not require you to abandon your life. It does not require you to retreat from the world, or reject your relationships, or demolish everything you have built on the surface. It requires something much more precise and much more sustainable than any of those dramatic gestures. It requires you to change the direction of your attention, consistently, deliberately, from the outside in to the inside out, from the reactive to the sovereign, from the surface to the depth. One moment at a time, one gap at a time, one diversion closed, and one diversion closed, and one more diversion closed, until the river is running full again, and the valley is abundant again, and the spring beneath the city is audible again to anyone who stops long enough to listen. You have been stopping long enough to listen. Right now, in this moment, whatever brought you here, whatever surface explanation your mind has constructed for why you are here, at the layer beneath that explanation, you stopped. You stood still. You listened for the vibration beneath the stone. You heard it. That is not nothing. That is the beginning of everything. There is a practice I want to leave you with. Not a complicated practice. Not one that requires equipment or a special environment or a particular amount of time. A practice that can be done anywhere, in any moment, and that addresses directly the mechanism we have been exploring throughout this entire transmission. The practice is called the return. It goes like this. At any point in your day, in any moment that you are able to remember to do it, you stop. Not physically, though physical stillness helps. You stop the movement of your attention. You notice where it is. You notice what it is entangled with. You notice the quality of that entanglement. Is it coherent or decoherent? Is it directed from the depth of what you are? Or is it being pulled by the surface of the external world? You do not judge what you find. You simply notice it, and then you ask the question, not out loud, not as a formal inquiry, as a simple, immediate, honest question. What is beneath this? What is beneath this reactive pull? What is beneath this habitual diversion? What is beneath the story I am currently telling myself about what is happening and why? What is beneath the surface of this moment? And then you wait. Not for a long time, not for a dramatic answer. You wait for the gap, for the small, quiet space that opens between the surface and the depth when you actually stop and look for it. The space that is always there and that you almost never find because you are almost never looking. In that space, even for a moment, even for a single breath, you are at the depth. You are in the implicate order. You are in the quantum field of infinite possibility that the surface world is a thin projection of. You are in what you actually are. And then the moment passes, and the surface reasserts itself, and the attention moves again, and the day continues. But something has shifted. Something at the level beneath the surface has registered the return. The depth has been touched. The veil has thinned by one more layer. Do this once today. Do it 3 times tomorrow. Do it every time you remember to do it for the rest of this week. And notice, not dramatically, not with high expectations, but honestly and carefully, what begins to change? Not in your external circumstances, not yet, though those will follow. In the quality of your experience, in the texture of your attention, in the sense of whether you are living from the surface or from the depth. The change will be subtle at first. It will feel like nothing, like a small adjustment in perspective that does not seem significant. But beneath that subtlety, something is building. The river is rising, the pressure is accumulating, the quantum coherence is increasing. The creative force that has been scattered across 1,000 reactive surfaces is beginning to gather. And when it gathers, when the coherence reaches a threshold, when the depth has accumulated enough presence in the surface to actually begin expressing itself through the surface rather than being covered by it, what emerges is not what you expected. It is not the comfortable expansion of the surface level awakening concept. It is something more precise, more demanding, more real. It is the depth of you expressing itself through the surface of your life for the first time, without the layers of misidentification and reactive attention and habitual diversion covering it. It is what you have been trying to reach your entire life, without knowing what you were reaching for. It is what this transmission has been pointing at from the very first word, and it was always there, beneath every layer of your experience, beneath every story you told yourself about who you are, beneath every moment of the life you have been living on the surface of something with infinite depth. It was hidden in plain sight, and now you can see it. The veil is not a wall, it never was. It is a membrane, a thin, permeable membrane between the surface you have been inhabiting and the depth you actually are. And membranes do not require force to pass through. They require only the right frequency, the right quality of attention, the right willingness to stop looking at the surface and look beneath it. You have been developing that frequency. You have been building that quality of attention. You have been cultivating that willingness, not in this video alone, in every moment of your life, where something in you refused to accept that the surface was the whole story, in every moment where the heaviness behind your eyes made you suspect that something was missing, in every moment where the vibration beneath the stone made you stop and listen. All of those moments were preparation. All of those moments were the depth of you sending signals through the surface, trying to thin the veil from the inside. And this moment, this transmission, this precise convergence of your attention and this particular arrangement of words and ideas and layers is one more signal, one more thinning, one more layer lifted. What has been revealed cannot be re-hidden. You have seen beneath the surface of awakening. You have seen the quantum mechanism beneath the spiritual concept. You have seen the ancient map beneath the modern understanding. You have seen the depth beneath the layer you are looking at. And the depth beneath the depth beneath the depth is still there, still waiting, still patient, still emitting its signal through every surface you encounter. You know how to listen for it now. You are no longer a surface dweller. You see the depth now. You feel the vibration beneath the stone. You know that what you have been calling your life is the outermost layer of something, with dimensions you have not yet measured, and you are ready to measure them. This is not the end of the excavation. This is the moment you picked up the first tool. The dig has just begun, and every layer you lift from here will reveal something that the layer above it was concealing. Something more precise, more demanding, more real, more yours. The crow of synchronicity has spoken. The door of initiation is open. The veil between the surface and the depth is thinner than it has ever been for you. What lies beneath it is not foreign territory. It is home. Welcome to what was always beneath everything. If something in this transmission landed at a layer beneath the surface of your ordinary understanding, if you felt the vibration beneath the stone, drop one word in the comments. Just one word, the word that describes the deepest layer you touched during this excavation. Not the layer you think you should have reached, the layer you actually reached. The honest word, the precise word, the word from the depth rather than the surface. If you know someone who is standing on the stone, feeling the vibration, suspecting that there is more beneath the surface of their life than they have been shown, share this with them. Not as a recommendation, as a transmission, as the act of lifting the veil for someone who is ready to see through it. When you share this, you are not simply passing along a video. You are giving someone access to a layer they have been sensing, but could not reach alone. You are creating shared depth between two consciousness fields. The veil thins collectively, and your act of sharing is part of that thinning. Consider returning to this transmission in a moment of stillness, in the quiet of early morning, or in the space before sleep, when the surface noise is lowest and the deeper layers are most accessible. What you hear the second time will not be the same as what you heard the first. The depth is not a private discovery. It is a shared recognition. And every person who finds their way beneath the surface makes it easier for the next person to find it. The veil thins collectively. The membrane becomes more permeable as more consciousness passes through it. You are part of that thinning. You have always been part of it. That is not a comfort. That is a responsibility. And you are ready for it. Stay beneath the surface. Stay with what you have found here. Let it work on you at the layers below the ones you are consciously aware of. The integration of a genuine layer lifting does not happen in the moment of the lifting. It happens in the days and weeks after, as the implications of what was revealed begin to surface through the layers above it. Pay attention to what surfaces, to what begins to look different, to what you can no longer unsee, to what the surface of your ordinary life begins to reveal, now that you know there is a depth beneath it. The veil is thinner than you think, and now you can see through it. The next layer of this excavation is already waiting. Reality has two layers, explores the hidden dimension where the real spiritual endgame is unfolding right now, the layer they deliberately buried beneath the one you have been shown. What you have uncovered here is the key that makes what is in that video fully accessible to you.